You're watching 12 WKRC TV, a new generation of news. 12 Newsmakers starts now.
Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. On January 9th, the Cincinnati Public Schools unveiled a sweeping billion-dollar proposal to rationalize, transform, and modernize its crumbling physical infrastructure. The plan proposes that 35 new schools be built, 24 on current sites and 11 on new sites, that 32 buildings be renovated, and that 13 buildings be closed. When it comes to implementing such a sweeping plan, the global vision is important but not determinative. This will take taxpayer support at the polls, and that means making a majority of voters happy and not riling up too much active opposition. As we all know, all politics is local, and when it comes to schools, local doesn't mean city, it means neighborhood. This plan has to be sold and embraced neighborhood by neighborhood across the school district. One of the first real tests came in Westwood last Thursday, where the proposal is to replace a century-old school. Before a community meeting, 12 News reporter Jeff Hirsch prepared this report that encapsulated the concerns that are sure to be repeated in many places across the city.
Well, this is my kindergarten class picture. In 1957, it says, where am I? I'm right here, this guy here.
When Mike Brestel attended Westwood Elementary School half a century ago, Westwood Elementary School was already half a century old.
There's that huge stairway that leads you up to the front door. There are basement rooms that were the boys and the girls' indoor gyms when we were kids. There's a really cool hallway that runs behind the rooms on the first floor, and I didn't know it was there for a long time, and it's kind of like a secret passage. We thought it was secret.
The school administration wants to build a new school in Westwood as part of a district-wide modernization plan. But the Westwood Civic Association, Mike Brestel is vice president, says hold on.
The best room in the building, though, is definitely the auditorium. It's just beautiful. And I'd forgotten just how beautiful that room is. It's a beautiful space. In the school, there's a Rookwood fountain inside. It's a beautiful school.
Westwood without Westwood School would be like Fountain Square without the fountain.
Well, Westwood School is at the center of the Westwood community.
If you tear this school down, it won't have big classrooms and the pretty wood in the halls. It is very unique and unusual, but we like it as it is.
The kids here want the school saved too. Phyllis Johnston's third graders have written essays.
It is very old and we don't want it torn down.
Hoping that half a century from now, they'll have the same memories that Mike Brestel has.
We want to save our school. We do not want you to make a new one and replace this school.
I was there from 1956 until about 1960. I would like to be there for the 100th anniversary.
To talk about the plan, I'm joined this morning by Stephen Adamowski, superintendent of the Cincinnati Public Schools. Stephen, welcome back to Newsmakers.
Great to be here.
You know, you've been on before. We've talked about this plan is a result of years of work.
Yes, it is.
And you've been here to talk before, and I've gone through I went through Fairmount with you one day, and we did a report.
Yep.
And it was very clear what the problems were there. But in a place like Westwood, at least visually, and to hear the community people and the children, what is the problem with Westwood?
Well, you know, I think we look at this in the context. Obviously, when we put out a facilities plan like this, it did represent several years of research and work with the Ohio State Facilities Commission, and certainly a compelling effort on our part based upon the need. You know, the condition of Cincinnati's schools has been just a chronic problem in our community for the last quarter century. We've known our schools have been run down. There's not been an opportunity until this time to really address this, and we're just excited that we're able to do it. This is an infrastructure issue. From an educational standpoint, it is one element of a good school system. As you're probably aware, our school system recently emerged from academic emergency. Now, you know, we've been working a lot on the program, and we have been reinventing ourselves to be effective. None of these things are a silver bullet, but taken together, they constitute a good school system. Buildings are a part of that.
What does a good building have to do with the program and the results?
Well, I think the research would suggest two big things. First of all, we know that environment does influence behavior. And if you put a student in a decrepit, rundown environment, behavior is different. You are aware as a historian that there was a time in our city when our schools were really temples of art and architecture, attempting to reflect the best of erudition and culture of the time. But those schools sent a message to students that we care about you. We respect you and your teachers. We hold ourselves, as the adults in the community, the same high standards that we hold you to in providing for your education. And ultimately, the message is that education is important. The second issue is, I think, one of adapting a building to the modern requirements of a standards-based system of education, where we're attempting to prepare students for a global economy. These buildings do not lend themselves to extended years because they're hot in the summer. They are not organized according to a team-based system, which we use now. They don't have the capacity for technology. I mean, they belong to an industrial age as opposed to a technological age. Having said all of that, we fully recognize that most citizens in Cincinnati, while they appreciate the need to do this, while they understand that this is an infrastructure issue that is important to every neighborhood, where if you let your schools crumble, your neighborhood will crumble. We also understand that there are issues like Westwood that have to be addressed. We have in the plan recommended an option for Westwood that
and
would.
I want to point that out, that in the proposal, it is not, the primary proposal is to say this building ought to be replaced on a new site. But there is a recommendation in the proposal, an alternative recommendation in the proposal, not just something coming from the community, but something you laid out and how to do it, that it just be renovated. Is that correct?
Correct. Now, in any one of these choices, there are advantages and disadvantages. The current footprint of the school, in terms of its land, does not meet state standards for green space and play area. And that is true in so many of our schools. In fact, when you look at the number of new schools being built, it is primarily due to the fact that when you build a school today, you need 3 to 5 acres and you need green space and playground area, as opposed to a little bit of blacktop. You also have to account for parking. We have no parking at the Westwood School either.
These were built in a streetcar
Sure,
setting.
absolutely. Now, if we go the route of renovating Westwood School, we will need to acquire some property around the school. And as you know, there are houses around the school. But again, working with the community, these are all smart people in Westwood, and they will, I'm sure, weigh the advantages and disadvantages of each approach and give us their best advice, and we'll do our level best to follow it, because our important objective here, the big picture, is that we provide the children of that neighborhood with an up-to-date school that is not too unlike schools that children go to school in other parts of our state.
Well, not only in other parts of our state, in other parts of our region. I think one of those of us who care about the city need to remember is that we've been building schools. We've just been building out in the suburban areas.
Exactly.
If you go to Lakota, you go to Mason, you go to Boone County, lots of new schools. This is another aspect of disinvestment from the center city.
In a time when our city is very concerned about equity and justice, I mean, I don't think there's any issue that embodies those two concepts as much as the issue of school buildings. Our intent is that children who grow up in the city of Cincinnati will have a school that meets the same standards as students in other parts of the region. And that is our primary motivation, because it complements the education program, brings it to a new level, but it also is, this will be the greatest economic development program our city has had in recent history, and it is a neighborhood infrastructure issue, absolutely.
You're asking people to come to these meetings, and they can fill out questionnaires, and we have some things that people can see better on the screen. They're up there right now. They fill out an individual questionnaire at the beginning of the meeting. They fill out a secondary questionnaire at the end, not about the plan in general, but the way the plan fits into their neighborhood. So this is the one for Thursday night's meeting in Western Hills, and it has very specifics about that part of the plan. What do you want to have happen at these meetings?
Well, what we're looking for two things, really. This is a complex plan, and while people are primarily interested in what's happening in their area of town, that is connected to what is happening in other areas of town. It's impossible to deal with this in one place without having implications for another, in large part because we are required to right-size the district relative to our enrollment. So what we're looking for, first of all, is to explain this. There's a lot of information here. It's fairly complex. We're looking for a forum to explain it and share information. once we have, I think, some common information for people to discuss, we're asking them for their viewpoints on the recommendations in their particular area of town. In many cases, as with the Westwood, as you pointed out, we have already indicated alternatives that appear to us, and in other cases, we have community members who are bringing forth alternatives that may not have been noticed by our planners. And so it's really this is the first draft. Following this process of public engagement, we'll issue a second draft. That's the one I hope our school board and the state facilities commission will adopt.
You know, one of the things, you know, we can talk about, get fixated on buildings as buildings. There's also an ongoing operational cost to keeping, one of the parts of this plan that I'm sure is controversial in some areas is closing buildings, reducing the number of buildings that you're operating. But that, it costs you to keep all those buildings open, right? Staff, all that kind of
every
stuff?
time we do that, we take away from the quality of education of children in other parts of the city. All these buildings have operational costs. They all require administrative overhead. The most conservative estimate of this is that when we are right-sized, we will save $5 million a year in costs that have nothing to do with education. Those are dollars that can be put into maintaining buildings, enhancing the educational programs of children who are attending school in other schools. So yes, there is a cost to all of this. We have an absolute responsibility to do things efficiently. And I think our challenge in this, which I think most members of our community appreciate, is to balance our absolute commitment to neighborhood schools. We, by the way, have more students walking to school today than we had in the last decade. And as this plan is implemented, we will have even more walking to school. And that's what we want. We want neighborhoods to be centered. We've got to balance our commitment to neighborhoods with efficiency.
I've got to let people know how they can get in touch with the rest of these meetings. The schools will hold 9 more community meetings over the next 3 weeks. This week, meetings will be held at Jacobs, Woodward, and Hartwell. All of the meetings will begin at 7 in the evening and are scheduled to last 2 hours. If you want detailed information about the date and location of the meetings in your area, check out the complete schedule at the website cpsboe.k12.oh.us. Woo! All right. Stephen, thanks for being here.
One of those free internet addresses. Right. Dan, thanks for your interest in this. And again,
you'll be back.
We'll be back.
Stay tuned. Tomorrow, when we celebrate Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, Kentucky will celebrate in a special way.
It occurred to me that I couldn't be in a school situation teaching kids that this was the greatest country in the world when they couldn't even go downtown to try on clothes or have a hot dog or buy a sandwich in a downtown restaurant.
Welcome back. As we remember the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King this weekend, it is important to recall that the civil rights movement was a product of the actions of hundreds of thousands of people in thousands of communities across the nation. Over the past 3 years, historians have been collecting the oral history of the civil rights movement in Kentucky. Tomorrow night, KET, the state educational channel, will air an hour-long documentary entitled Living the Story, the Civil Rights Movement in Kentucky. Here's an excerpt from the program with a resident of Louisville recalling the power of Dr. King and his commitment to active nonviolence.
Every day before we would demonstrate, we would raise our hand and take a pledge that we would be nonviolent as we were demonstrating. No matter if rocks were thrown, eggs, if we were spat upon or arrested, we would remain committed to the philosophy that we would not physically retaliate. I remember one afternoon, a guy spat on me, and I wanted to grab him so bad. But I had taken the pledge, and I couldn't.
I am very pleased to be joined this morning by Betsy Brinson, the director of the Kentucky Civil Rights Project and the executive producer of Living the Story. Betsy has come up this morning from Lexington, and I really appreciate that. I know that you got up early, and this is an important project, and we, so many of our viewers, about a third of our viewers are in Kentucky. So Thank you and welcome.
Well, thank you. It's been a real privilege to work on this project.
Tell me about the scope of the project, because it's not just about this show, it's about something much larger, right? What's the scope?
Well, actually, about 4 years ago, we began to collect the stories, and we wanted to do that statewide, and we've collected about 175 interviews, which range anywhere from 2 to 8 hours, depending on the individual and their involvement. And then about a year into that project, we said, well, what are we going to do with all this? You know, we don't want to just put it away in an archives and hope that historians will use it someday. And at that point, teachers and parents and policymakers were saying, you know, first off, young people today really have no understanding of what a segregated society was all about. And we think you need to help teach them that. So we got into the idea of doing the documentary to talk a little bit about a segregated society, but also to talk about the individual and the organizational actions in the 50s and the 60s to bring about social change.
Now, how much of that story had historians, professional historians, already pounded out? And how much, for Kentucky now, and how much of it are you really sort of uncovering and getting down and getting documented for the first time?
Actually, very little has been written about the 50s and 60s struggle. There's a good bit of writing and good writing about earlier periods of black history in Kentucky, but this is really a first. And one of the reasons we decided we've got to do this now is that a lot of these older movement leaders have either died or they're aging and their health is poor. And we thought if we don't begin to capture this, we don't have it. There are very few written records. A number of the newspapers, unfortunately, knew things were going on in Kentucky and elected not to cover them.
In fact, some of the stories, you have one of the people that's featured, and we're not going to show a clip of him this morning, was a reporter for the Louisville Courier-Journal, right?
Right. Well, I do have to say most of our archival material comes from the Courier-Journal. They did a good reporting job, and they also editorially were helpful to the struggle. But that's not the case.
How did you find most of the people, and what was sort of the range of people? There's a lot of stories about Louisville, a fair number of stories about Lexington, and stories about southern and western Kentucky. I got to say, there isn't a whole lot about northern Kentucky or eastern Kentucky.
No. Well, we did actually interview people in northern Kentucky and eastern Kentucky. And regretfully, it was time and money and the fact we had 58 minutes that we had to narrow down to 15 people from 175 people. We could have used any and all of them. But we actually found them a lot by word of mouth. Looking at organizations and organizational histories, talking to individuals who were active in them at the time, talking to some policymakers, legislators, for example, from the black community.
Actually, as long as you bring up a legislator, I want to show another little segment from the show. And in this excerpt, Georgia Davis, the first African American to serve in the Kentucky Senate, describes how in her first term she bargained with her colleagues. They needed her vote to pass Daylight Savings Bill, highly controversial then. She needed their support for her proposed open housing bill.
So he came to me and he said, if I get your bill out of the committee, will you vote with us? I said, I don't know. You have to get it out with the expression that it should pass, because that would give impetus to the bill once it gets to the floor. So the very next morning, he met me at the Capitol door and he said, I got your bill out of the committee. I said, oh, great, Tom. I said, let's check it at the Senate office, Senate clerk's office. And we did. They had reported it out with the expression that it should pass. Now you gonna vote with me? I said, not yet. What's the matter? I said, you take this roll call sheet. Everybody that you got committed to vote for your bill, daylight savings time, you check them off and get them committed to vote for mine when it hits the floor. Oh, boy, he snatched the paper and took off. About 2 hours later, he came back with all the commitments. I had the roll call. I was checking as they voted, and that bill passed 27-3 with 8 abstentions.
One of the great things about oral history is that you could write that, she could write that story down, but it's the verbal inflections, it's the facial reactions that adds to that, the eye movements. It's really fascinating.
That's true. And I would have to say that of 175 people, and a few more, we only had about 3 or 4 people who turned us down. Several people said, you know, they had put that past behind them. They didn't want to bring it up again because it was painful. One individual said he'd sort of done what he could do during the time, and that was enough. But it was painful for people, and there were times with the oral history interviews that I had to simply turn the tape recorder off and let them kind of cry a little bit, get themselves together again. It is a painful past.
What do you hope happens with, I mean, you got 175 interviews, that's for the future, but with this immediate hour-long documentary tomorrow night on KET, what do you hope happens with that? How do you hope it gets used?
Well, I think what will happen based on showing segments of it along the way to groups is that people will look at it and they'll say, oh, I remember my story. And it doesn't matter whether you're black or white. You have, if you've lived long enough, you have some recollection of what segregation was all about. There are about 15 viewing parties across the state of Kentucky tomorrow night with the show. And these are large public meetings after the showing, there'll be a discussion. And
one of those is at Northern Kentucky University.
That's
is that correct?
That's correct. And people who want more information can contact either President Jim Vitruba's office out there or the faculty Cheryl Nunez, who's organizing it. But I think people will remember their stories. If they're young enough, they don't. Very frequently, people 40s and 30s will say, you know, I've lived here all my life and I never knew that any of this happened. And so it's that kind of awareness. And of course, what we really hope, particularly with young people who are going to use this in the high schools, we think we've made the point with the documentary that it was by and large high school and college age youth that organized this movement and carried it out. And we hope we're sending the message to them that it is possible to make social change, and one person can do it. And it may not be black civil rights, it may be some other social justice issue, but there are things that you need to do to prepare yourself for that.
One of the interesting things was, and this comes through when you see the entire documentary, that the movement was not just, although primarily driven by blacks, there were whites who cooperated with the civil rights movement in Kentucky and throughout the United States. And that is an important part of the story. How about interviewing people who at that time were absolutely opposed to progress on civil rights? Have you done any of that?
We tried very hard to find some people who took that position. But, you know, many years have lapsed, and those people either said, well, they had changed their mind now, they had a different perspective on it all, or they simply refused to be interviewed.
Yeah, after 1972, it's impossible to find anybody who voted for Richard Nixon, you know.
Right.
But we quickly forget some of those things or don't like to talk about them anymore. I want to make a couple of points here. Some basic information, especially for teachers. You do have a website, and we can show some of this. The Living History show has a website, ket.org, and in that site there is a section for teachers that has lesson plans, bibliographies, timelines, biographies, all sorts of things. Here's the details about the show. It is tomorrow night at 8 o'clock on KET, and it can be viewed also at NKU in this viewing party. Betsy, thank you for coming up this morning. Thank you for your work with collecting these stories, and I'm sure it's going to be ongoing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Each segment of the Living History, Living the Story ends with a poetry reading. Here is one of those readings by Frank X. Walker.
Kentucky, beautiful, ugly cousin, I too am of these hills. My folks have cornrow tobacco, laid track, strip mined, worshipped and whiskied from Harlan to Maysville, Old Dunbar to Central. Our Whitney Youngs and May Street kids cut their teeth on bourbon balls, and though conspicuously absent from Millionaire's Row, we have Isaac Murphy'd our way down the back stretch, Cassius Clay'd our names in cement. We are the amen in Church Hill Downs, the mint in the julep. We put the heat in the hot brown and gave it color. Indeed, some of the bluegrass is black.